Okay, go ahead.
Perfect. So we're the ESDN, the European Security and Defense Network. And ESDN is a student society that aims at creating a platform for discussions between the students and alumni of the College of Europe and different experts and practitioners who are active in the field of security and defense. And today we have Professor Smith, and we're going to talk about whether CSDP is weakening or strengthening NATO. I am Elena, and I'm the part of this discussion are also going to be my colleagues Michele COLAZZO and Marta also. So this discussion around whether CSDP strengthens or weakens NATO started around 1990s, around that time, or almost 30 years ago. But recently, the discussion took another turn. The discussion is mostly around the strategic autonomy and how strategic autonomy influences the dynamics in the transatlantic relations when it comes to defense and security. But this is why we have the pleasure, and we're very happy to have Professor Smith and talk more about it and find out his opinion on whether CSDP is weakening or strengthening NATO. So, Professor Smith, what do you think? Is CSDP weakening or strengthening NATO?
Well, first, let me say thank you, Elena, for inviting me and giving me the opportunity to discuss these things, as well as with these fantastic students as well, who I know are interested in these things as much as I am, maybe even more these days. So thank you for that. Is it weakening or strengthening? I think that all depends on what the end game is. And you won't be surprised to realize that I don't think anyone quite knows that yet. And until that's really, it's thought through. I mean, it's been thought through many times, but until everyone agrees on what the end game is, then it's hard to say. So I would say currently at the moment, no, it strengthens NATO. I think, they each have a role to play, and they kind of, they should be focused on what they do best and where their particular skill sets and instruments are most applicable. So there's some kind of, I think, there's some built-in paradoxes there. If you think about the EU as a peace project, which I think we all agree it is, coming out of the Second World War and after, there's still people uncomfortable with a peace project of that type having hard military capabilities and trying to be strategic about how they use those, and having to make some difficult decisions on applying those types of instruments. And there's some member states, of course, that fall into the more neutral category who have a hard time with that as well. So there is an underlying kind of tension there already built in. There's another tension that could say, if the EU accomplishes, and you use the words strategic autonomy, first of all, I think there's some debate over what strategic autonomy is. You see a lot of reports, a lot of talk about, is this fit for purpose? Is NATO fit for purpose? Is CSDP? Well, everyone always focuses on the fit part, but hardly as much on the purpose part. So how can you say what's fit if you don't know the purpose, right? So if the EU achieves strategic autonomy, then what's the purpose of NATO, right? And vice versa, if it doesn't, what's the purpose of CSDP? And of course, colleagues of mine, Julian Howard in particular, is sort of unpacked different options of how that could end in the long run. But already you see a kind of tension there. So I think you can think about this at that grand strategic level, or at a more structural level. But I don't think there's another tension. If you want better EU-NATO cooperation, how does that reinforce strategic autonomy? Right? Those are kind of another tension that, it's either you have better cooperation because you need both, or you're trying to do this on your own, and there you would maybe use NATO as a for the Europeans to use NATO as a way to develop um, their experience, their political will, their confidence as actual leaders in this domain, and not as reliant on the U.S. Through NATO. But again, I think the jury's still out amongst the different member states on how that ultimately is wanting to be played out. So again, I think you can think of this at that kind of grand level and the logics there that are sort of built into this. But then you can sort of say, well, here's where we are. We're talking since 2016, talking about better EU-NATO cooperation, lots of different avenues for that type of cooperation. It's mainly being driven at the inter-organizational level due to political barriers to act at the strategic level that I'm sure you're well aware of and we won't get into. So then you can say, well, if they're going to cooperate, then let's talk about those more practical issues. Excuse me. And on that side of things have come a long way since I got into this. When I started investigating EU-NATO relations, it wasn't quite 30 years ago. It felt like it, but it feels like it. But in those days, in the sort of early 2000s, mid 2000s, there wasn't much going on really because of the political blockage. And if you worked in the organizations, and there wasn't many people doing this at that time, if you worked in sort of in the realm of CSDP, in the commission, or more likely in the council, or if you worked in NATO and you had some kind of a brief that covered EU-NATO relations, again, it was a pretty small group of people in those days. A lot of them got frustrated, right? Because they were trying to push more cooperation. They could see the value in it, the strategic value, and if nothing else, deconflicting and who's doing what and trying to not step on each other's toes, or especially if they're in the same operation space, which again, in the early 2000s, that wasn't happening as much. But by the end of the 2000s, it was happening quite a bit. But most of those initiatives got blocked pretty quickly at the political level. And so, like yourselves, if you were in a job where you spent a lot of time and effort trying to repair or sort of enhance cooperation with working with another entity over there, and every time it led to nothing, well, after a while, you would probably think, well, I'll focus somewhere else. Now, in those days, again, as the operational level was intensifying, piracy, counter-piracy, Kosovo, Afghanistan, and then potentially Libya, but although it didn't really go down that way, that was what was driving the relationship. It was really driven at the operational level, and the fact that the Deputy Supreme Allied Commander in NATO was also double-hatted as an EU commander for Berlin Plus meant there was a kind of bridge there, or a sort of, at least a sort of a push at that level. But it was pretty much, it was focused on the operational. And what I argued in my PhD essentially was that if the further away from Brussels and the lower down the operational command, the more likely you were to see good cooperation. And the more it was sort of subsumed in wider milieu of cooperation, so there was other, EU people, NATO people, but also other organizations in the room. Then it was easier to kind of look the other way for the political level. So all those, I think, are still there. But of course, still since 2016, there has been a real push on this, right? And so again, if you come back to the broad strokes, the broad strategic thinking about this, how is this going to go? Clearly, the threat environment is much different now than it was even in the 2000s. And I think personally, it's only going to get more challenging. And so again, that brings you what is CSDP for? Of course, so you have the threat environment that's challenging and only going to get more challenging. You have types of capabilities and disruptive technologies that are making all of this more difficult. And you have, in terms of potential adversaries and threats to defense and security from outside Europe or the North Atlantic area, let's say. These are working in what they call the gray zone. They're working in areas that lead up to, but still below the threshold of any type of real military, heavy military activity so far. So again, what does all that mean? At the same time, you have the UK leaving the EU, which, in a political sense and an institutional sense, that maybe releases some energy for CSDP to develop, right? If we can think of the UK as somewhat of a traditional blocker on that in terms of large military approach, military capabilities in terms of operational headquarters and things like that. But at the same time, you've lost a significant member or contributor in terms of real capability to CSDP. So again, it depends if you're more about the organizations, the names, badges, the institutions, or what the effect of that is going to be. And again, I think people have different opinions on that. So it doesn't look like Brexit is leading to the Rexit, or however you want to call it, but it's not off the table, right? It's not completely inconceivable. So the one possibility, and again, I go back to Julian Howard, who really unpacked these in at the end of a kind of a conclusion to a special issue we wrote a few years ago. That if you have that unraveling, it could go back to just national defense, and national defense through NATO primarily. Another option is you have more CSDP, but not strategic autonomy. So more, but not a lot more. It tends to focus on what it does best. You try to find maybe a division of labor. And here, I think Thierry Tardy has a very good recent paper on this about first and second responders. NATO primarily focusing on collective defense through the nations, but the EU opening up and doing what it does best. And therefore, it's a win-win because it's sort of it reinforces both, but it reduces the kind of what's called doubling up of expenses and things like that. And that's my feeling is where we'll go, right? It'll be a bit in the middle. It always is a bit in the middle. It's never one or really the other extreme. But the final one would be the EU really does want to become strategically autonomous in the fullest sense. I mean, in the hard military realm as well, starts to take over collective defense as well as doing human security type of broader issues. And then you have to ask what happens to NATO. Does NATO become Europeanized, and they start to use it, they start to be more of a lead, use it to demonstrate leadership, and the US starts to withdraw with maybe some kind of assurances that if there was a really, if there was some kind of a huge issue, defense issue, that they would be involved. And then the EU becomes a real strategic actor. I don't see that happening at the moment. And in some ways, it might be healthy. It might be healthy. It might be good for the US and it might be good for the Europeans. But there are still those Europeans that are in NATO and not in the EU that will feel very slighted by that. And in fact, the Canadians maybe as well, right? So you can think of Turkey. Turkey already felt quite slighted when the CSDP was generated because they felt they were in the community, in the house, and then all of a sudden the neighbors moved next door and they were sort of left, on their own. So all these things I think are still there. So we'll have to see it. So at the moment, yeah, I don't think it undermines NATO, or I think it complements NATO. But then that's a different question. If strategic autonomy is really developed in the full sense, does that undermine NATO, or is it actually good for everyone? I think it's too early to say on that because nowhere near achieving real strategic autonomy. In terms of CSDP, I buy the Major and Molling line that it's over-institutionalized, under-equipped, and strategically divided. I think that was a pretty good title for a chapter that kind of summed it up pretty well. So that's my take on it, but I'm happy to hear the students and what they think, or any questions arising.
Yes, I think your last words summed up very well the current situation that we have within the CSDP. Lots of perspectives, takes on that is divided, and there is still a lot of work to be done in order to have a clear, clear position on that. So I think now my colleagues have some follow-up questions. Marta, would you like to ask your question?
Yeah, sure. Thank you for being with us this morning. So, the question that or I guess afternoon, the question that I have is, will the EU's plans to achieve strategic autonomy affect its relationship with the alliance? I know you kind of touched upon it already, but just if you could give us a little more thoughts on that. Thank you.
Yeah, we had the luxury of the NATO ambassador from Canada join our module that I teach last year, and I thought he touched on this as well. You know, and again, I think we're a long way off on that. It would also have to be said, you know, if the Europeans really went for this, what would be the American reaction? Because at one point, in one sense, they go about the Europeans need to do more. Need to be able to do more, but of course they want them to do more in a certain way, right? So they like NATO because it helps their foreign policy agenda as well. So there could be a bit of a schizophrenic, or there has been a bit of a schizophrenic approach to that. But I think there's two ways to think about that. One is, you know, is the sort of solidarity of it. You know, I thought we were all, you know, the North Atlantic area, I thought we were all in this together kind of thing, and doing it for such a long time. It's a robust alliance. And then there's the other issue that's more around markets and defense economies. And I think I think that is going to be a difficult one. You know, I think the US are quite strong on that and are trying to preserve their markets, you know, there and competition between the Europeans. And then there's also European member states that are wary of that sort of divide as well. And so essentially, I think for some of the Europeans, if they thought it could be done through strategic autonomy, they might think about it. I just don't think they believe that, and so they want the collective defense still through NATO because they essentially want the Americans to be involved. So I think it depends on how that's managed. There's a lot of variables that would go into that. Who are the kind of political leaders in power as that process is happening? I can think of one that just sort of left, that it probably would have been a quite divisive and rocky situation. Maybe under a Biden administration or what follows, this could be managed in I think as long as there's honesty and discussions about it, and trying to find something that is mutually beneficial for the Europeans and in the North, the Canadians and the Americans and the other non-EU NATO members, then it can be managed. But that is not an easy thing to do.
Michele, I think you also have a question.
Thank you very much again, Professor, for being with us today. And my question is more on the future of the relation. So how do you expect, Professor, the future of the relation, the cooperation between NATO and CSDP to evolve? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I think it will, I think there'll be a lot more efforts done at the inter-organizational level. They'll keep pushing that. They'll use the different summits and ministerials to sort of talk about more EU-NATO cooperation, how it's important. I have a set of slides that I use on this that, you can go back to 2001 and the importance of the EU-NATO strategic relationship. And I think that's questionable if it's been strategic. It doesn't seem like it's going to be politically led, right? Because even if you look at the documents that are there, the documents that talk about EU-NATO cooperation and things like that, they're not signed by political leaders. It's not a NAC sign. It's the SecGen and then the HR and things like that. So therefore, it's being pushed more. There's a kind of understanding that they need to do more, but it's still constrained by wider political agreements. And so it's still not really strategic if you can't put all these people in the room together to discuss these issues ongoing and produce documents and decision-making planning based on them. Could it therefore be more operationally led? I don't think there's not a lot of stomach at the moment for large scale stabilization military operations for any, it's coming out of Afghanistan and Iraq and Libya and Syria, there's not. So a lot of these will be coalitions. Again, there's questions of who's willing to actually put in capability. It'll depend on what the case is, who's in power, who's willing to do, and then they'll look for the right mechanism to do it. If it happens to be an area where there's good crossover for EU NATO, I think you'll find good cooperation. It's like anything political. When the stars align, there's political will. It will happen. If there's not, it doesn't. So I don't think there's too much going operationally, sort of large scale operation, because CSDP doesn't seem to be doing that, and even NATO doesn't want to do that at the moment. If it's more human security and sort of capacity building, then they might deconflict and they might work and share information, but essentially they're getting on with two different jobs, so there might not be that much need for close cooperation. Where I think you'll find good cooperation is in areas where there is a sort of military and a sort of civilian legal aspect. So cyber security, cyber defense, mobility, and these kind of things where, they can use each other quite well. I always thought the counter-piracy mission was a good example of good EU-NATO cooperation, because although NATO had a naval operation, and so did the EU, and you could say that was competition. They actually deconflicted pretty well. But what the EU had that NATO didn't was wider instruments and tools to provide legal arrangements for captured pirates or legal arrangements with target countries where they want to develop and do capacity building. So I think it'll depend on the issue, the operation, but I think you'll see more talking about it. And I think you always have to ask, is this more about the internal politics or is it more about the end effect? And I think the first one is hard enough and it's usually in that area. The third one is really difficult. And unless you have good, real cooperation, then it's going to be hard to achieve that. But I say, a lot of times they might just be in there, and once they've agreed who's doing what and where, then they'll get on with their own day-to-day, jobs and different types of instruments that they're applying to the situation.
Thank you so much, Professor. So this brings us to another kind of topic or heated debate around duplication, around overlap. So shall we understand from your vision that if there will be political will, there will also be less overlap?
Well, it depends if there's diverging political wills, I suppose, and therefore there still could be overlap. Again, I can come back to Tardy's proposal. It's a good one to try to reduce that overlap. But certainly, if the EU goes down the road of full strategic autonomy for high-end collective defense and military, crisis management operations, and the NATO members, a lot of the NATO member states, including the US or others, are unhappy with that, then it might lead to duplications and overlaps. But I mean, the other thing to remember here is all of this is now being discussed in a very, not only a deteriorating security environment, but a deteriorating economic environment as well, not considerably from COVID, obviously. And so it's going to take some time. And of course, member states and whether in the EU or NATO are going to have to make hard choices. And we can remember not so long ago to the financial crisis of 2008 and then what the impact that had on European militaries. A lot of them still not recovered really. And this will only continue on that. So people can't afford duplications. People can't afford, in some cases, at all. And so duplications are not going to be what people want. I think it's quite often it's important, if you're trying to tease out the rhetoric, is look at the difference between what some political leaders, at the sort of executive level or in foreign ministries are saying versus MODs, or Ministry of Defenses, and their sort of take on it. So clearly there needs to be collective efforts to help reduce that. But everyone knows that. But it's getting around the key problems of sovereignty, of sharing, of trust in your allies, that if you go down the sharing or specialization or some kind of cooperative route, that capability or instrument is going to fit your needs, and the other partner be willing to use it when you want to use it. And these are very difficult. It's hard to do at 2 or 3. It's extremely difficult to do at 26 or 27 or 28, 30, where everyone wants a piece of capability that's slightly different to tailor their own needs. And here you can get into dual use. So that might be a good way to reduce duplications of, especially if you can find military capabilities that can be dual used as more civilian and also, human security type of capabilities that help in that way as well. Intelligence and coastal patrolling and things that go into that. Human security and migration and the things that are coming out of instability to the southern flank of Europe. That's, I think, what is needed.
Professor Smith, we're coming slowly to an end of our discussion, unless you, Michele or Marta, want to add something. All right. Thank you so much, Professor Smith, for taking your time to talk to us, for insights, and for bringing a bit of light in this discussion, which is very confusing on one hand, but also taking place in very uncertain times right now. So I think
I quite often joke when it comes to EU-NATO relations or CSDP-NATO relations, from when I started to now, not much has changed. In some ways, there's just a lot more people doing it, a lot more people talking about it, a lot more institutions and things like that. But some of the underlying, barriers and problems are still remain.
Indeed.
So thank you for inviting me for this discussion.
Thank you, Professor Smith.
Thank you very much, Professor.
We will let you know when we will publish it on the channels of the ESDN.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you.